right. Hello, everyone. I wanted to talk a little bit on the politics of China's population and the policies of population planning. If you guys know anything about like the history of China, especially in the 20th century, you know that China probably has one of the, I guess one way to put it is most unique ways of policy planning, population planning policy, which is a bit of a tough thing to say with all those P's. But we're gonna dive right into it. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is China's population just as a concept. So today, China has a population of a little over 1.4 billion people. That's almost around 18% of the world's population lives in China alone. And because of that, today China is the most populous nation on Earth. This is nothing new. China, throughout almost all of history, has been the most populous nation, country, whatever terms they have used throughout the country's history for almost all of recorded history. It's this became a sticking point when China's population really exploded during the 19th century, with emphasis put on that latter half of the 19th century after 1950. During this period from 1950 to today, China's population has nearly tripled, starting around 550 million around 1950 to being a little over 1.4 billion today. A lot of people credit China's large population as one of the leading factors in its incredible rate of economic growth throughout the 20th century. So, to put that into perspective, China has grown very quickly in a very short period of time, and that population, that workforce, those natural human resources have helped China's growth economically throughout that 20th century. So, with those positives of population, mostly those big amounts of human resources and all that, there are also concerns when a country grows a very large population. So, it's very difficult to kind of take care of a population like this. People need houses, people need food, people create waste, all these kind of things. And it doesn't help that China, and notably in the 20th century, had historically dealt with things like famines and like poor growing seasons and these kind of things. And so these kind of things worsened during the programs like the Great Leap Forward and several other of the policies that were implemented under the leadership of the Communist Party. There also was large debate amongst a lot of nations over the problems with overpopulation, because as we can see when we compare it on our last slide, China was not the only country that was growing very fast. Countries like India, the continent of Africa, Latin America, even Western Europe and the United States to a lesser extent were also seeing population booms, and people were concerned over problems of world overpopulation at this time. And the Chinese communist officials were not immune to these concerns. So leaders like Deng Xiaoping, along with leaders like Li Jianyan and Hua Yufeng, which I probably didn't pronounce all of those correctly, can't even pronounce the English words correctly, they were growing concerned with this issue of overpopulation. So where did this boom in China's population come from? So this early population growth in China that we see sparked during the 20th century was generally a result of a lot of the policies of Mao Zedong after he came into power. Mao Zedong actually governed over a period that saw a decrease in birth rate. However, Mao Zedong's government saw a near doubling of Chinese life expectancy and a drastic decrease in infant mortality, which meant more people were surviving birth and people were living much longer. So even though these birth rates were declining, the death rates weren't keeping up in a way that would reduce population, and China's population was exploding during this period, as previously mentioned. This was not something that the Zedong government was concerned about. In fact, the Zedong government very much saw a population boom as part of a key part of the policies to make China a successful country throughout the 20th century. He believed that more children and bigger families were important for the economic growth of the country, that these human resources were very much necessary, and he very much encouraged people to have more children and these kind of things, especially earlier on in his leadership. Later on, during like the 70s, he got a bit more concerned with this, but that was very, very late into his governance of the country. So, with the death of Mao in the 70s, the Communist Party ended up under new leadership, and they started to grow concerned with the aforementioned issues of overpopulation. This was around the time that those leaders that we mentioned beforehand were reading books on overpopulation. They were going to international meetings about the issue. They were very concerned with this issue. So, to begin, the government started to put in place programs to help curb the country's growth. This included things like increasing access to birth control and encouraging couples to marry later. This is fairly standard methods of population control that we see throughout the world. This is nothing new. These kind of things are practiced in developing countries all the time. It's one of the most standard ways to kind of control a birth rate in order to help with natural resource consumption. And these policies actually did end up curbing birth rates, but once again, we still saw a continued population growth as the death rates really didn't start to kind of keep up with these declines in birth rates. So in 1979, communist official Chen Yun proposes a one-child policy. In 1980, the government met to discuss the implementation of a one-child policy. What would this look like? And they set a goal that they believe that the golden Chinese population is they should aim for around 700 million Chinese people. And they believed that the policy of the one-child policy would be the only way to achieve that goal. Meanwhile, just a few years later, China's population actually would manage to cross 1 billion. So it was a growing and growing concern. It is, I believe it's around 1982 was the census that first found that China had crossed 1 billion. So what did this policy look like in practice? So the policy, generally considered one of the most extreme examples of population control implemented in all of human history. So the punishment for breaking the policy often saw fines larger than the average Chinese citizen's annual income, and failure to pay off these fines often led to confiscation of property, and the confiscated property was often critical to the citizen's occupation. For example, they would steal things like farm equipment from a farmer, so on and so forth. The policy did end up decreasing the birth rate in the country and slowed population growth, but the population of China still increased. And that is true even to this day, where the population is still increasing. However, we'll get into how that's changed later in the presentation. So basically, the policy in practice, like the name says, is one child per family, which fairly simple. And then if you had more than one child, they would have these fines, so on and so forth. If the fines weren't paid, we get the deal. So in its conception, the policy was meant to be universal, so every Chinese family was meant to only have one child. However, almost immediately after the inception of the policy, they needed to make exceptions. So, for one, the policy was much less popular in rural areas than urban ones. In the urban areas, this kind of family model of one child per parents was already being widely adopted. Many families were already only having one child in these urban areas. Meanwhile, the story in rural areas was much different. You needed multiple children because multiple children would work on farms, they'd take care of their elderly relatives, so on and so forth. So you needed more than one child in order to kind of survive in these areas. So quickly after the inception of the policy, exceptions were made for ethnic minorities and rural families, and then families of handicapped children as well. So if your first child was born with a disability, you were given an exception and you were allowed to have a second child. Because of these exceptions, it's estimated that approximately 50% of China's population was actually living under a two-child policy. So in a way, calling it a one-child policy is a bit of a misnomer because so much of the population wasn't actually living with a living under a one-child policy because they were exceptions to the rule. And of course, with such an extreme policy of population control, we had many problems arise from this policy. So one of the first problems that people started to notice was that China's gender ratio started to shift. The Chinese culture often prefers men to women, as the aforementioned, like children working on the farms, children taking care of their elderly relatives, that was more often done by men than it was for girls. So when the technology emerged for ultrasound sex determination, we saw a great rise in female abortions. And when the policy was first introduced, China's gender ratio was about 3 to 4% more male than female, which was already it's a bit abnormal, but nothing too crazy. But it shifted into the double-digit differences as the policy went on and as these technologies became more available. Additionally, many children, especially those in rural areas and areas where the authorities were less likely to check, they went unreported when they were born. And this was to avoid penalties, to avoid the fines, to avoid the confiscations of property. However, as a result, under the Chinese government, since these children aren't reported, many of these children grew into adults who would be ineligible for things like education, employment. They couldn't find jobs. They couldn't even get schooled in the country because they weren't reported. They don't qualify for the benefits that a normal Chinese citizen might get if they had been reported as born. So in a way, they're not even a person, as the Chinese government would be concerned. Additionally, China's declining birth rate and increasing life expectancy has actually led to a disproportionate elderly population. As we can see on the graphs on this side, we can see kind of the shift towards a male society, as well as projections in 2050 for the average age of the Chinese population, peaking in the 60s in the projection, while in the 90s it was around the 20s. So as time went on, these problems started to kind of stack up and get bigger and bigger. And in 2015, it was announced that the policy would be coming to an end. When they ended the policy in 2016, it was replaced with a two-child policy to try and bring birth rates down and back up to the country's aging, and bring birth rates back up to combat the country's aging population. However, one of the most recent studies, and I mean very recent, just this year, the Chinese census found that the country's population is not just continuing to plateau, but it's also growing at its slowest rate yet. And the current Chinese government is actually trying to kind of revamp, get these population numbers kind of going back up, because they're starting to undershoot projections that they were given before. So they've actually recently implemented a 3-child policy, and it's so new that today we don't know what the effects are. However, it is expected to kind of combat this slowed growth of the country and help them to continue their economic growth that they've been experiencing over the past couple decades. However, what comes from this policy is yet to be seen. And then I have linked sources, and this will be going up on YouTube. I will be copying these links into the description so that they are clickable and usable. Otherwise, that is a short and concise history of the one-child policy in China.